Melvin had recently married Linda, and for all appearances, his life seemed to be on an upward trajectory. At 45, he had achieved success in the business world, running a profitable company that allowed him to provide a comfortable lifestyle for his new family. Linda, his 37-year-old wife, had been a single mother for years before they met. She was kind-hearted, hard-working, and deeply protective of her 20-year-old daughter, Jasmine, who was in her second year of college. Together, they lived in a spacious home in a quiet suburb of Chicago, surrounded by well-kept lawns and respectable neighbors. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Linda was thrilled with her new marriage. After years of struggling as a single mother, she finally felt that she had found a stable, loving partner in Melvin. He was attentive, generous, and seemed genuinely committed to making their blended family work. Linda's primary goal was to bring Melvin and Jasmine closer together. She dreamed of creating the picture-perfect family she had always wanted, one where her daughter would bond with her new husband and they could all live happily under one roof. However, things weren't as simple as Linda hoped. While Melvin made efforts to connect with Jasmine, their relationship was strained from the start. Jasmine, though polite, remained distant. She had been close to her mother for years, and the sudden appearance of Melvin in their lives made her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to having a father figure around, especially one who wasn't her real father. There was a coldness in her interactions with Melvin, a subtle tension that both of them felt but never spoke about. Jasmine often kept to herself, retreating to her room or spending time at college to avoid prolonged interaction with him. Melvin, for his part, noticed the distance but didn't push too hard. He was aware that stepping into the role of a stepfather wasn't easy, especially with a college-aged daughter who had grown up without a man in the house. He tried to be supportive, offering to help with her studies, inquiring about her interests, and even attending some of her school events with Linda. But each time, Jasmine would answer with brief responses, clearly uncomfortable. The more Melvin tried to reach out, the more she seemed to withdraw. Linda, oblivious to the subtle tension between them, often left Melvin and Jasmine alone, hoping they would bond naturally. She believed that, in time, Jasmine would warm up to him. After all, Melvin had all the qualities of a good stepfather. He was patient, thoughtful, and never overstepped his boundaries. But what Linda didn't realize was that Jasmine's wariness ran deeper than just adjusting to a new family dynamic. Jasmine had always been perceptive. She noticed things that others missed, and in the months since Melvin had moved in, she began to sense something off. It wasn't that Melvin had done anything explicitly wrong, but there were moments that made her uncomfortable, too many glances held a little too long, too many questions that felt too personal. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she didn't trust him. Even though Melvin had never crossed any obvious boundaries, Jasmine felt that their interactions had an underlying tension, and she instinctively kept her distance. Despite Jasmine's reservations, there were moments when she and Melvin were forced to interact. With Linda often working late, Melvin and Jasmine were left alone in the house more frequently than either of them would have liked. These moments of solitude became increasingly awkward as they found themselves crossing paths in the kitchen or watching TV in the living room in strained silence. Melvin, aware of Jasmine's discomfort, tried to break the ice in small ways. He would ask about her studies, compliment her on her achievements, and attempt to engage her in conversation. Sometimes, it worked, and Jasmine would respond, though cautiously. But more often than not, she would cut the interaction short, retreating to her room before things could become too familiar. As the weeks went by, Linda began noticing that Jasmine wasn't warming up to Melvin as quickly as she had hoped. She brought it up with both of them at different times, encouraging them to spend more time together. But her efforts only made Jasmine more resistant. Jasmine confided in a close friend from college that she didn't feel comfortable around Melvin, though she couldn't explain why. She didn't want to worry her mother, but the growing unease inside her was becoming harder to ignore. Meanwhile, Melvin became more aware of the walls Jasmine had built between them. He told himself that she just needed more time, that she would eventually come to accept him. But he couldn't deny that he was starting to think about Jasmine more often than was appropriate. Every interaction, no matter how small, stayed in his mind long after it was over. He found himself looking forward to moments when they were alone, hoping for more opportunities to engage with her, even though he knew these thoughts were wrong. He justified it as wanting to build a stronger bond with his stepdaughter, but deep down, he knew there was something more behind his desire to be close to her. As Linda continued to enjoy her new life, unaware of the undercurrents of tension between her husband and daughter, the atmosphere in the house grew more complicated. Melvin and Jasmine were like two opposing forces, pulled together by circumstances but pushed apart by unspoken discomfort. The more time they spent in each other's presence, the more both of them struggled with their own internal conflicts. And as much as Jasmine tried to keep her distance, their paths kept crossing, setting the stage for something neither of them could control. This new family, which had once seemed like a fresh start, was beginning to unravel before anyone fully realized it. The cracks in the facade of their perfect suburban life were forming, hidden beneath smiles and polite conversation, but growing deeper with each passing day. What Linda saw as harmless tension between a new stepfather and his stepdaughter was, in reality, something far more dangerous, a brewing storm that would soon engulf them all. As time passed, the dynamic between Melvin and Jasmine began to change in subtle but significant ways. With Linda working late more frequently, the house was often quiet, leaving Melvin and Jasmine alone for long stretches of time. Initially, these moments were awkward, filled with small talk and occasional silences. But as the weeks turned into months, something shifted between them. Melvin started to take a greater interest in Jasmine's life. It began innocently enough. He would ask about her classes, her friends, and her future plans. He genuinely wanted to connect with her, believing that if he could bridge the gap between them, it would help solidify his new role in the family. Jasmine, though still somewhat reserved, began to open up in small ways. She shared details about her studies, her ambitions, and the pressures of college life. Their conversations became more frequent, and with each one, Melvin found himself drawn to her in ways that felt unsettling. At first, he brushed it off as a natural part of trying to bond with his stepdaughter. After all, Jasmine was smart, ambitious, and beautiful. But Melvin couldn't deny that his attention toward her was shifting from the purely paternal. His eyes lingered on her longer than they should have, and his thoughts about her started to intrude at inappropriate moments. He caught himself looking forward to the times when they were alone, the times when Linda was away at work and the house was theirs. Jasmine, for her part, also noticed the change in their interactions. Though she had initially been wary of Melvin, she couldn't help but appreciate the attention he was giving her. He seemed genuinely interested in her life, something she hadn't felt from anyone in a long time. At first, it felt comforting. Melvin listened to her, encouraged her, and offered advice when she needed it. But as their conversations grew more personal, she began to sense an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the atmosphere between them shifted noticeably. Linda was working late again, and Melvin had suggested they watch a movie. They sat side by side on the couch, the dim light from the screen casting soft shadows across the room. Halfway through the movie, Melvin asked Jasmine if everything was going well at school. She responded casually, but their conversation drifted into more personal territory. Melvin started asking about her friendships, whether she had been dating anyone, and what kind of future she envisioned for herself. As Jasmine talked, she noticed the way Melvin was watching her, his eyes focused, attentive, almost too engaged. She felt a strange flutter in her stomach, a feeling that was both unfamiliar and uncomfortable. But she didn't stop talking. There was something about Melvin's attention that she found reassuring, though she couldn't explain why. She had never felt this close to him before, and in that moment, she realized that she didn't mind it. For Melvin, the conversation felt like a turning point. He realized he was no longer just trying to get to know Jasmine as his stepdaughter, he was fascinated by her as a woman. He tried to push the thought away, telling himself it was wrong, but the feeling had already taken root. As she talked, he leaned slightly closer, his body language betraying his growing interest. Jasmine didn't pull away, but the air between them grew thick with unspoken tension. Later that night, after Jasmine had gone to her room, Melvin sat in the dimly lit living room, his mind racing. He couldn't deny what he was feeling anymore. He was attracted to Jasmine. The realization hit him like a wave of guilt. How had things gone this far? He loved Linda, he reminded himself. She was his wife, and she had trusted him with her family. But now, he was starting to feel something for Jasmine that went beyond what was appropriate, and it terrified him. He tried to rationalize it, convincing himself that it was just a fleeting thought, a moment of weakness. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The next few days only heightened the tension between them. Melvin became more cautious in how he interacted with Jasmine, trying to suppress the growing attraction he felt. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop thinking about her. He began to find excuses to spend more time with her, offering to help her with errands or suggesting they grab dinner when Linda was working late. Each time, he told himself it was harmless, that he was just trying to build a better relationship with his stepdaughter. But the truth was harder to avoid with each passing day. Jasmine, meanwhile, was also struggling with her own feelings. She couldn't deny that she had started to enjoy Melvin's attention. She liked the way he made her feel, special, cared for, important. But at the same time, she was confused. She knew that her relationship with him wasn't like the typical relationship between a stepfather and stepdaughter. There was something beneath the surface that made her uneasy, but she couldn't fully grasp what it was. Then there was the guilt. Jasmine loved her mother, and the thought of betraying her in any way felt wrong. But the line between right and wrong was becoming increasingly blurred, especially when Melvin was around. There were moments when she found herself looking forward to their time alone, moments when she wondered if what she felt was just admiration or something more. She didn't dare explore the thought too deeply, afraid of where it might lead. One evening, Melvin found himself alone with Jasmine again. This time, they were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner. Linda had left early for work, leaving them to finish the meal alone. The conversation, as usual, started innocently, but it quickly veered into more personal territory. Melvin asked Jasmine if she was happy, truly happy. The question caught her off guard, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "I'm okay," she finally said, though her voice lacked conviction. Melvin leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching hers. "You deserve more than just okay," he said softly. Jasmine felt her heart race at his words. There was something in the way he said it, something that made her feel both vulnerable and strangely comforted. She looked down at her plate, unsure of what to say next. The silence between them was heavy, loaded with emotions neither of them could fully express. That night, as Jasmine lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about Melvin's words. They echoed in her mind, mingling with the confusing feelings she had been trying to suppress. She knew she shouldn't feel this way. She knew it was wrong. But the lines between what was acceptable and what was forbidden had started to blur, and she wasn't sure she could stop what was happening. Melvin, too, lay awake that night, battling the growing guilt and desire within him. He knew that he was walking a dangerous path, but the pull he felt toward Jasmine was becoming harder to resist. Each passing day brought them closer to a point of no return, and deep down, Melvin knew that whatever happened next could destroy everything. The evening started like any other, but the atmosphere in the house felt different. Linda had left earlier that morning for a business trip, her absence stretching over several days. The house, usually filled with her presence, now felt emptier, quieter. It was just Melvin and Jasmine, alone under the same roof for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The tension that had been simmering between them for weeks seemed to thicken with every passing hour. Melvin tried to keep things casual. He cooked dinner, asking Jasmine if she wanted to join him. She agreed, though the weight of unspoken emotions hung heavily between them. They sat at the kitchen table, exchanging small talk, but the conversation never quite flowed. Melvin noticed the way Jasmine avoided his gaze, her responses short, as though she was trying to keep the conversation from becoming too personal. He could feel her discomfort, but it only made him more aware of his own growing internal conflict. After dinner, They both ended up in the living room, the television on but ignored. Melvin sat on one end of the couch, Jasmine on the other. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small table lamp in the corner. They had watched TV together before, but tonight felt different. The distance between them on the couch felt significant, yet fragile, like it could be bridged at any moment. Jasmine kept her eyes on the screen, but Melvin could tell she wasn't really paying attention. The tension in the air became palpable when Melvin finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, trying to sound casual, but failing to hide the emotion behind his words. Jasmine glanced at him briefly before looking away again. "Just tired, I guess," she replied softly. Melvin nodded, though he could sense that there was more to her silence. He felt the pull of his emotions growing stronger, the internal battle he had been fighting for weeks coming to a head. He told himself to stay in control, to keep things light, but the urge to close the distance between them gnawed at him. He could see the same uncertainty in Jasmine's body language, the way she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Minutes passed in silence before Melvin made the decision that would change everything. He moved closer, slowly, as if testing the boundaries. Jasmine didn't move at first, her eyes still fixed on the TV, but she could feel his presence growing nearer. Her heart raced, torn between the urge to leave and the pull of something she couldn't fully understand. Melvin's hand rested on the cushion beside her, his fingers brushing against her arm. The moment felt suspended in time, the air around them thick with tension and anticipation. Jasmine finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of confusion and fear. She didn't pull away, but the look on her face was enough to make Melvin hesitate. For a brief second, he considered stepping back, breaking the moment before it could go any further. But then Jasmine, as if driven by the same confusing emotions, didn't move. Before either of them could process what was happening, Melvin leaned in. His hand found hers, his touch gentle but deliberate. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she allowed the moment to unfold, their emotional closeness finally crossing the line into something physical. It was a brief, fleeting connection, just a moment where the boundaries between them were irreversibly blurred. But as quickly as it happened, the weight of reality came crashing down on both of them. Jasmine pulled back, her face flushed with panic. She stood up abruptly, taking a few steps away from the couch, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what had just happened, and the gravity of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. I need to go to bed," she stammered, not meeting Melvin's eyes. Melvin, still sitting on the couch, watched her, frozen by the enormity of what had just taken place. He wanted to say something, to explain or apologize, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was racing, a mixture of guilt, desire, and regret swirling inside him. He knew, in that moment, that he had crossed a line that could never be undone. The brief touch, the fleeting connection, it had changed everything. Jasmine hurried out of the room without another word, disappearing down the hallway toward her bedroom. Melvin remained where he was, his hand still resting on the spot where she had sat moments before. The room felt colder now, the silence oppressive. He sat there for what felt like hours, replaying the moment over and over in his mind, trying to understand how things had spiraled so far out of control. The following days were marked by a strange, suffocating silence. Jasmine avoided Melvin as much as possible, barely speaking to him, and when she did, it was in short, clipped sentences. She spent most of her time in her room or at college, leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. The tension between them was unbearable, and neither of them knew how to address what had happened. The brief moment they had shared weighed heavily on both of them, but for Jasmine, the guilt and confusion were overwhelming. She couldn't believe that she had allowed things to go as far as they did. Every time she thought about it, a sick feeling settled in her stomach. She avoided being alone with Melvin at all costs, terrified that it might happen again, or worse, that her mother might find out. Jasmine's once close relationship with Linda became strained as well, the guilt of hiding something so significant tearing her apart from the inside. Melvin, on the other hand, was consumed by his own internal battle. He couldn't stop thinking about that night, the brief but powerful connection that had passed between them. He knew it was wrong, everything about it was wrong. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't push the memory away. It haunted him, filling him with a sense of shame and longing that he couldn't escape. He tried to act normal around Linda, putting on a facade of calm and control, but inside he was unraveling. His feelings for Jasmine had spiraled beyond his control, and he knew that the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. His emotions had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The boundary between them had been broken, and both Melvin and Jasmine were left to grapple with the consequences. They had stepped into dangerous territory, and though neither of them wanted to admit it, they both knew that things would never be the same again. The weight of their actions hung over them like a dark cloud, and the once peaceful household was now charged with unspoken tension and buried guilt. As the days passed, the distance between them grew, but the impact of that night lingered in every interaction, every glance, and every unspoken word. They both tried to bury their emotions, to move on as if nothing had happened, but deep down, they both knew that what they had done had set in motion a chain of events that could only end in disaster. Jasmine's world had begun to crumble beneath her. The brief moment she had shared with Melvin, the crossing of that forbidden line, weighed heavily on her every waking thought. Guilt gnawed at her, an ever-present reminder of how wrong everything had become. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror without feeling disgusted, couldn't stand to be in the same room as her stepfather without a cold sense of dread settling in her stomach. She knew that what had happened between them was unacceptable, and her instinct to distance herself from Melvin grew stronger each day. Jasmine tried to avoid him as much as possible. She would leave the house early, before Melvin had a chance to say anything to her, and stay out late, using college as an excuse to keep away. At home, she remained locked in her room, only emerging when she knew Melvin wasn't around. The atmosphere in the house had changed drastically, becoming thick with tension. Every interaction between them, no matter how brief, felt loaded with the weight of their shared secret. Melvin, however, wasn't willing to let the situation fade so easily. He could feel Jasmine pulling away, and it drove him to frustration. What had once been a small, manageable infatuation had grown into a toxic obsession. He had crossed the line with Jasmine, and instead of feeling remorse, he found himself wanting more. Her attempts to distance herself from him only fueled his jealousy and possessiveness. He watched her carefully, noting every time she avoided him, every time she shut him out. It stung him in a way he hadn't anticipated, and soon his frustration began to fester into something darker. Linda remained blissfully unaware of the growing tension between her husband and daughter. Her work had kept her busy, and she hadn't noticed the subtle changes in their behavior. But Jasmine's increasing withdrawal couldn't go unnoticed forever. Linda had always been close to her daughter, and when Jasmine began to act cold and distant toward her as well, Linda started to worry. One evening, while the three of them were sitting down for dinner, Linda noticed the way Jasmine barely touched her food and avoided eye contact with both her and Melvin. The silence at the table was heavy, and the air felt charged with something Linda couldn't quite put her finger on. Jasmine excused herself early, retreating to her room without saying much. Linda watched her go, then turned her attention to Melvin, who was also unusually quiet. "Is something going on with Jasmine?" Linda asked, her voice laced with concern. Melvin shrugged, keeping his eyes on his plate. "She's been distant lately. Maybe it's just college stress." Linda nodded, but the uneasy feeling in her chest only grew stronger. Over the next few days, she began to notice more of Jasmine's strange behavior. Her daughter was always avoiding being in the same room as Melvin, and when they were together, the tension was palpable. Linda found herself watching them closely, though she couldn't quite place what was wrong. She wondered if Jasmine was struggling with something deeper, but didn't know how to approach her without making things worse. Things escalated when one of the neighbors mentioned seeing Melvin and Jasmine together in what appeared to be a tense, intimate moment. It happened when Jasmine had returned home from college one afternoon. The neighbor had spotted them in the front yard, standing too close, their body language suggesting something beyond a simple conversation. When the neighbor casually brought it up to Linda during a routine chat, Linda's mind began to race. At first, she dismissed it as nothing, perhaps just a misunderstanding. But once the seed of doubt had been planted, Linda couldn't stop herself from seeing things differently. The next time she observed Melvin and Jasmine together, she paid closer attention. There was something about the way Melvin looked at Jasmine, something possessive and unsettling. Jasmine's behavior, too, seemed off. She was quiet, her body language stiff and uncomfortable, as if she was afraid of being near him. Linda's suspicion grew, and she found herself replaying moments in her head, little things she had brushed off before, the awkward silences, the strained dinners, Jasmine's increasing withdrawal. It wasn't long before Linda's suspicions exploded into confrontation. One evening, after Jasmine had retreated to her room again, Linda finally confronted Melvin. She couldn't hold back any longer. The tension in the house had reached a boiling point, and she needed answers. "What's going on between you and Jasmine?" Linda asked, her voice sharp with accusation. She had intended to stay calm, to approach the subject carefully, but her emotions had gotten the better of her. Melvin, taken aback by the sudden confrontation, quickly tried to deflect. "What do you mean?" "Nothing's going on. She's just been distant lately, that's all." "Don't lie to me," Linda snapped. "I've seen the way she acts around you. She's scared of something, and I want to know what it is." The intensity of Linda's accusation caught Melvin off guard, and for a moment, he hesitated. He could feel the walls closing in around him, the weight of what had happened between him and Jasmine pressing down like a vice. He tried to maintain his composure, but his defensiveness only fueled Linda's suspicions further. "I'm not lying," Melvin insisted, though his voice wavered slightly. "She's been going through a tough time, that's all. It's probably just stress from school." Linda wasn't buying it. "Don't you dare lie to me," she repeated, her voice shaking with anger. "I know something's wrong. A neighbor saw you two together the other day, too close. You think I'm blind? I can see what's happening." Melvin's heart raced as he realized how close Linda was to uncovering the truth. He knew that if he didn't find a way to de-escalate the situation, everything would come crashing down. But the guilt, the jealousy, and the fear of being exposed had pushed him to the brink. His attempts to stay calm only made him seem more suspicious, and Linda wasn't going to back down. "What did you do?" Linda demanded, stepping closer to him. "What happened between you and Jasmine?" Melvin, his mind racing, searched for an explanation that would satisfy her, but there was no easy way out. The tension between them had escalated to the point of no return, and he could feel the situation slipping out of his control. "Linda, please," Melvin began, his voice pleading. "You're making this into something it's not." But Linda wasn't listening anymore. She had seen enough, heard enough, and her mind was racing with the worst possibilities. As the confrontation reached its peak, the thin veneer of their family stability shattered. Linda's suspicions had been confirmed, and though she didn't know the full extent of what had happened, the truth was closer than either of them could bear. The house, once a place of comfort, had become a battleground of secrets and lies. And now, with Linda's suspicions out in the open, the fragile balance that had kept everything hidden was about to collapse. The house was quiet, but the air was thick with unresolved tension. Melvin could feel the weight of Linda's accusations hanging over him, her words echoing in his mind. She had grown more suspicious, more certain of the unspoken truth that had been festering beneath the surface for weeks. Melvin's patience was wearing thin, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. He knew that Linda wasn't going to let it go, and the thought of everything he had built coming crashing down was more than he could handle. That evening, Linda finally confronted Melvin in a way that left no room for evasion. Her voice was sharp, filled with anger and betrayal. She stood in the kitchen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, staring at him with fury in her eyes. "I know what's going on between you and Jasmine," she spat, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "You've been acting strange for weeks, and she's terrified of you. Do you think I'm stupid? You've crossed the line." Melvin's heart raced. He tried to deny it, tried to push back, but Linda wasn't having it. She stepped closer, her face inches from his, her voice low and threatening. "If you think I'm going to let you get away with this, you're wrong," she hissed. "I'll go to the police. I'll ruin you. Everyone will know what kind of man you really are." The threat hit Melvin like a sledgehammer. His mind raced with the possible consequences, his life destroyed, his reputation shattered, prison. The walls were closing in, and he felt trapped. He had never intended for things to go this far, but now, with Linda's words hanging over him, he was on the verge of losing everything. Fear turned to anger, and the anger quickly spiraled into something darker. "Linda, you don't understand," Melvin started, but his voice was shaking. "Don't you dare try to explain this." Linda interrupted, her voice rising. "I trusted you. You were supposed to be part of this family, and now you've poisoned everything." The confrontation escalated quickly. Linda's accusations became more heated, and Melvin's frustration turned to panic. He could see the storm building in her eyes, the determination to destroy him, and it terrified him. She was going to take everything from him, his life, his freedom. In that moment, a terrible realization settled in: he couldn't let her do it. As the argument intensified, Melvin's hands clenched into fists. He could feel the blood pounding in his temples, his vision narrowing as the world around him faded. Linda's words became a blur of accusations and threats, and the panic in his chest exploded into pure, blinding rage. He didn't even realize what was happening until it was too late. In one violent, uncontrollable moment, Melvin lashed out. His hand struck Linda hard across the face, the force of the blow sending her stumbling backward into the kitchen counter. She gasped in shock, her hand flying to her cheek, but before she could react, Melvin grabbed her by the shoulders. The rage that had been simmering for weeks erupted in a fury he couldn't control. Linda struggled, her voice rising in panic, but Melvin was beyond reason. His hands tightened around her neck, and they crashed to the floor in a violent struggle. It all happened so quickly, too quickly for Melvin to comprehend. His mind was a whirlwind of anger and fear, and before he knew it, Linda's body had gone still beneath him. The silence that followed was deafening. Melvin stared down at Linda's lifeless form, his hands still trembling. Blood rushed in his ears, his heart pounding as the reality of what he had just done sank in. Linda wasn't moving. Her eyes were open, but they were vacant, her chest no longer rising and falling with breath. The color was already draining from her face, and a cold dread gripped Melvin's heart. He hadn't meant to kill her. The thought echoed in his mind, but it felt distant, unreal. He backed away slowly, his hands shaking as he stared at Linda's body. The anger had drained from him, replaced by a hollow, numbing shock. He had lost control. His rage, his jealousy, his fear, they had all culminated in this one tragic, irreversible moment. But the nightmare wasn't over. Jasmine had heard the commotion from her room. She had been hiding there, trying to escape the tension that had gripped the household for days. When the argument had started downstairs, she had curled up on her bed, wishing it would end. But the sudden crash and the silence that followed had drawn her out of hiding. When Jasmine entered the kitchen, her eyes fell on the scene in front of her, her mother lying motionless on the floor, and Melvin standing over her, frozen in horror. Jasmine's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of the situation hit her. Her mother was dead, and her stepfather, Melvin, the man she had once trusted, had killed her. Jasmine let out a strangled cry, backing away in disbelief. Melvin's eyes met hers, and in that moment, both of them realized the gravity of what had just occurred. The family was destroyed. The fragile balance they had been trying to maintain had shattered completely, leaving behind only chaos and tragedy. Melvin's mind was racing. He had killed Linda, there was no going back. But now Jasmine was standing there, a witness to everything. He wanted to explain, to tell her it had been an accident, that he hadn't meant for things to go this far. But the words wouldn't come. He could see the terror in Jasmine's eyes, the disbelief and betrayal. There was nothing he could say to make this right. Jasmine stumbled back, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. She couldn't believe what she was seeing, but she knew she had to call the police. Melvin's heart sank as he realized what was happening. The life he had known was over. In a matter of minutes, the police would arrive, and he would be taken away. The world would know what he had done, and there would be no escaping the consequences. Within the hour, the house was swarming with police. Melvin was arrested on the spot, his hands cuffed behind his back as he was led out of the home that had once been his sanctuary. Jasmine watched in silence, her heart broken, her mind spinning. The tragedy that had unfolded in their once peaceful home had destroyed everything. Her mother was gone, and her stepfather, the man who had once promised to be part of their family, was headed to prison for murder. The trial that followed was swift and brutal. The evidence was clear, and Melvin's guilt was undeniable. He was sentenced to life in prison, leaving Jasmine to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. She struggled to come to terms with what had happened, haunted by the guilt and the memories of her mother. In the end, the family had been torn apart by secrets, jealousy, and uncontrolled emotions, leaving behind nothing but devastation.